In the year 1000, Paris, one of the largest cities north of the Alps, held about 4,000 people. That's roughly the size of a modern high school. By 1300, it had grown 20-fold. Florence and Milan housed 100,000 people or more, rivaling anything in the Islamic world. The single most important development of the High Middle Ages was something that sounds almost boring: population growth. Europe's population doubled between 1000 and 1300, and the doubling set off a chain reaction that rebuilt European civilization. Cities revived, trade expanded, financial tools grew sophisticated. To understand how, we need to start with the numbers, and then we figure out what drove them. In Europe's population between 500 and 1500 follows a striking arc. For centuries after Rome's fall, the numbers barely moved, roughly 25 to 30 million people through the early Middle Ages. Stagnation. Then, starting around the year 1000, something extraordinary happened. The population surged, roughly doubling from about 35 million to somewhere between 70 and 100 million by 1300. 3 centuries of sustained, remarkable growth, and then catastrophe. The Black Death arrived in 1347, and within a century, Europe's population crashed to levels not seen since the darkest years of the early Middle Ages. This trajectory matters. The growth of the High Middle Ages sits sandwiched between stagnation and collapse. It wasn't a steady upward march. It was an exceptional window, and understanding why it opened is the key to everything that followed. Before we explore what drove this growth, we need to understand the demographic baseline. In the pre-modern world, roughly 25% of babies died before their first birthday. Another 25% died before adulthood. Life expectancy at birth hovered between 25 and 35 years, but that number misleads. It's an average dragged down by massive infant mortality. A person who survived childhood could reasonably expect to reach 55 or 60. Life expectancy at birth is a statistical measure, not a biological ceiling. Against this brutal baseline, any sustained population growth required something unusual: the removal of extra constraints beyond the ordinary deadliness of pre-modern life. 3 major constraints had suppressed Europe's population for centuries. The first and most devastating, bubonic plague. In the 6th century, a pandemic swept through Europe, sometimes called the Plague of Justinian, killing millions. The disease lingered for 200 years, flaring up in repeated waves. Then, around the year 750, it vanished. Plague simply disappeared from Europe, and no one knows exactly why. It did not return for nearly 600 years, not until 1347. That absence was transformative. For 3 centuries, from roughly 1000 to 1300, Europe was completely free of a disease that killed 50 to 60% of those it infected. The removal of this single constraint opened enormous demographic space. The second constraint, external invasion. During the 9th and the 10th centuries, Vikings struck from the north, Arabs attacked from the south, and Hungarians swept in from the east. These raids destroyed the Carolingian Empire, draining population through violence and slave-taking. By the late 10th century, all 3 threats subsided. The third constraint was subtler: agricultural slavery. Rome relied on slave gangs working large estates. Slaves could not form families and didn't reproduce themselves, a built-in demographic break. Between the 6th and the 10th centuries, slavery gradually gave way to serfdom. Serfs, laborers bound to the land who owed work to their lords, could form families and have children. By around 1000, serfs had replaced slaves as Europe's dominant labor force. 3 constraints removed, 3 breaks released. Removing obstacles was necessary but not sufficient. Something had to actively push growth forward. The most transformative push came from agricultural technology, and the key innovation was the heavy plow. The Romans used a light scratch plow perfectly suited to thin, dry Mediterranean soils. Shallow plowing worked well there, deep plowing causes erosion. But Northern Europe had completely different ground, heavy, waterlogged clay. This was potentially the continent's most fertile land, but a Roman scratch plow barely broke its surface. The medieval heavy plow solved this problem. It rode on wheels and carried an iron plowshare that cut deep into the earth. Behind the blade sat a moldboard, a curved metal plate that flipped the cut soil over, creating drainage furrows in waterlogged fields and exposing rich nutrients buried beneath the surface. For the first time, farmers could cultivate the dense clay soils of northern France, Germany, and England. Vast stretches of previously useless land became productive farmland. Two more innovations amplified this transformation. First, the padded horse collar. Romans harnessed horses using a yoke designed for oxen. On a horse, this yoke pressed against the windpipe, choking the animal. The medieval padded collar rested on the horse's shoulders instead, letting horses pull heavy plows at full strength. Horses move faster than oxen while matching them in pulling power, so a single farmer could cultivate significantly more land each day. Second, the water mill. Romans had the technology but rarely built mills because slaves ground grain by hand. As slavery declined, water mills spread across Europe, especially during the 11th century. Mills freed human labor from the backbreaking work of grinding grain, redirecting that energy toward clearing forests and reclaiming new farmland. Nature cooperated too. From roughly 800 to 1200, Europe experienced what climatologists call the little optimum, a sustained period of warmer, drier climate. Greenland was verdant enough to earn its name. Grapes grew further north than they do today. For agriculture, warmth and dryness were critical. They prevented crop rot. Together, new technology and favorable climate drove grain yields from roughly 2:1 to 4:1. Those ratios sound abstract, so here's what they meant for an actual farmer. At a 2:1 yield, every seed planted produced 2 at harvest. 1 had to be saved for next year's planting. That left exactly 1 seed to eat, 0 margin for error. 1 bad harvest meant famine. At 4:1, the farmer harvested 4 seeds, saved 1 for planting, and had 3 left over. A modest surplus, but enough to survive a bad year, and crucially enough to feed people who weren't farming at all. That surplus made cities possible. More people didn't just mean more mouths to feed. Population growth transformed where and how Europeans lived. The numbers tell the story. Large Italian cities, Florence, Milan, Venice, grew from 10 to 20,000 around the year, 1,000 to 100,000 or more by 1300. A tenfold increase, Paris exploded from roughly 4,000 to 80,000, a 20-fold expansion. Major northern European cities surged from a few thousand to 40 or 80,000. For perspective, Baghdad and Cairo already held populations above 500,000 in the year 1000. Europe was catching up, not leading, but the transformation was real and consequential. Tens of thousands of people living in cities were, by definition, not growing their own food, and someone else had to feed them. And that simple fact reshaped Europe's entire economy. Cities of this size created something that hadn't existed in Europe for centuries: urban consumer markets. A city of 100,000 needs bread, meat, leather, wool, timber, and iron every single day. That daily demand pulled surplus production out of the countryside and into commercial networks. Once these markets reached a critical mass, they attracted merchants from far away. Around the year 1000, foreign traders rarely bothered with Europe. Too few customers with too little money. By 1200, the continent had become a destination. The population boom had created the preconditions for what historians call the commercial revolution, a fundamental expansion in the scale, range, and sophistication of European trade. Italian merchants stood at the center of this commercial revolution, and geography explains why. Italy sits in the middle of the Mediterranean, the natural gateway between East and West. Luxury goods from Asia, spices, silk, precious stones, traveled through overland and maritime routes to ports in the Eastern Mediterranean. Constantinople, Acre, Alexandria. Italian merchants from Venice and Genoa purchased these goods and shipped them back to Italy. From there, the goods traveled north over the Alpine passes to the great Champagne fairs in central France. The Champagne fairs were medieval Europe's central marketplace, seasonal gatherings where merchants from England, Germany, Spain, and Scandinavia came to buy and sell. Italian luxury goods flowed north. Northern products, English wool, German metals, Scandinavian timber, flowed south. A commercial network spanning the entire continent took shape for the first time since the Roman Empire. The most dramatic extension of this reconnection was Marco Polo, a Venetian merchant who journeyed overland to China in the 1270s and 1280s, reaching the court of the Mongol Emperor Kublai Khan. Polo spent years in Asia and returned with accounts of wealth and sophistication that astonished his contemporaries. His voyage would have been unthinkable 2 centuries earlier, not because the route didn't exist, but because no European commercial network was developed enough to sustain such a venture. And as trade grew more frequent and complex, the economic tools Europeans used had to grow more complex too. The clearest measure of that sophistication is something tangible and precisely datable: coinage. Coinage serves as a precise diagnostic of economic complexity. The Roman Empire operated what's called a trimetallic system, a monetary system using 3 metals for 3 tiers of commerce. Gold coins handled large transactions, land purchases, military payrolls, international trade. Silver coins covered mid-range exchanges, livestock, bulk goods, professional services. Bronze and copper coins served everyday purchases, a loaf of bread, a cup of wine. Each metal existed because the transactions it served existed. Now consider Europe around the year 1000. Gold coins had vanished, bronze coins had vanished, only silver remained, and this wasn't random or accidental. Gold and bronze disappeared because the transactions they once facilitated had disappeared. No one conducted commerce large enough to require gold. The economy had simplified to the point where silver alone could handle everything that remained. The monetary system had contracted to match a shrunken economy. Then in 1252, the city of Florence minted the gold florin, the first major gold coin struck in Western Europe in centuries. This was not a symbolic gesture. Florence minted gold because gold-sized transactions had returned. International trade deals, large-scale banking operations, and major purchases now required a denomination larger than any silver coin could conveniently provide. Within decades, other cities followed Florence's lead. Meanwhile, debased silver coins, silver mixed with cheaper metals, filled the role that Roman bronze once played, handling small everyday transactions. By 1300, Europe had effectively rebuilt a trimetallic system: gold for large commerce, good silver for mid-range, debased silver for daily needs. The monetary structure Rome had needed to run a complex economy had re-emerged because European economic life had recovered to that level of complexity and was poised to surpass it. Pull these threads together and a chain reaction emerges. Several constraints: plague, external invasion, agricultural slavery, lifted around the same time. Several active drivers: the heavy plow, the horse collar, the water mill, a warmer climate, kicked in simultaneously. No single cause was sufficient. Together they produced 3 centuries of sustained population growth, a doubling of Europe's people between 1000 and 1300. That growth revived urban life, transforming tiny settlements into cities of tens and hundreds of thousands. Those cities became consumer markets large enough to attract long-distance trade. That trade reconnected Europe to Asia and the Mediterranean, channeling goods through Italian intermediaries to the Champagne fairs and beyond. And commerce at that scale demanded more sophisticated financial instruments, gold coinage, credit arrangements, professional banking. Each link depended on the one before it. Population growth was the foundation. The commercial revolution was the structure built upon it. And the whole edifice rested on conditions that would not last. After 1200, the little optimum faded, temperatures dropped, growing seasons shortened. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 killed millions across northern Europe. Then, in 1347, bubonic plague returned with devastating force. The Black Death killed roughly a third of the continent's population within 5 years. Subsequent waves pushed the toll higher. By 1460, Europe's population had fallen to somewhere between 35 and 45 million, less than half its 1300 peak, no higher than it had been in the year 1000. 3 centuries of growth erased. Many European regions would not recover their 1300 population levels until the 17th or even 18th century. The High Middle Ages were not an inevitable march of progress. They were a window of opportunity opened by a rare alignment of circumstances sustained for 3 remarkable centuries and closed when those circumstances changed. The demographic boom of 1000 to 1300 was that exceptional, and the collapse that followed was that devastating.